Meditations of our hearts be ever acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. Amen. Please be seated. So who noticed a theme in the readings today? Today is Good Shepherd Sunday. And the readings for this Sunday are chosen from the many, many references in the Bible to Jesus' relationship with the church and with humanity as a shepherd to his sheep. So this week I'm not going to compare you to hamsters. This week we get to be sheep. The 3-year schedule of our lectionary has different shepherd-related readings for the 3 years A, B, and C. And because now all of you are sitting there trying to remember, it's year B, and I did have to look it up. Except for the Psalm, which is the same for all 3 years. Psalm 23, the Lord is my shepherd. How many of you know it by heart? It's almost impossible not to know Psalm 23 by heart because we hear it so often in not just in our Episcopal lives, but in society at large. Along with the creation story, the nativity story from the Gospel of Luke, the Sermon on the Mount, and the Lord's Prayer, I would put Psalm 23 as one of the top 5 most recognized, best-known Bible passages. It's one of the Psalms attributed to King David, who, if you recall, started out his professional life as a shepherd. So it's no surprise then that the analogy of God as a shepherd and his people as sheep came very naturally to him. The imagery in this psalm is very simple, but it's very effective. Lying down in green pastures and walking beside still waters conjures up images in our heads that are lovely and relaxing, which is one of the reasons this psalm is so often read by people who are in some kind of crisis. But the most striking image from the psalm, from verse 4, is not a soothing one. Though I walk through the valley... There you go. When I hear the valley of the shadow of death, if you've read The Lord of the Rings or seen the movies, you think about Mordor, don't you? With the big rocks and nothing growing, and there's goblins waiting to jump out on you, and the only light is Mount Doom with that big red eye on the top, right? It's not a good place for sheep. The only reason a sheep would wind up there is if it wandered away from its herd. That's the thing about sheep. If you've ever lived on a farm or had dealings with them, they are not really bright as farm animals go. That's why they need a responsible shepherd, a good shepherd. So our readings today tell us about the qualities that make a good shepherd. He leads the sheep. He does not let the sheep lead him. When the shepherd is in the lead, the herd stays in the green pastures and by the still waters. Left to their own devices, the sheep are going to go any which way, including very possibly valley of the shadow of death. Verse 4 of the psalm tells us, "Thy rod and thy staff, they comfort me," which are the tools that a shepherd uses to keep his flock together. He doesn't use them to beat or punish the sheep. He uses them to keep them in one mass. A sheepdog fulfills the same purpose, and I'm sure that King David only left that out because thy rod and thy staff and thy sheepdog did not fit the meter. So our first quality of a good shepherd is that the good shepherd gives his sheep the limits they need to keep them safe. The good shepherd knows all the details about each sheep. He knows them so well that he calls each of them by a special name. And that's why it's good. I'm not a shepherd because I do not know what I would name them except for fluffy, really fluffy, not very fluffy. The good shepherd understands each sheep's traits and needs. He sees each sheep as an individual. And conversely, the Good Shepherd keeps all these individuals unified in one fold. In the gospel reading, Jesus says, "I have other sheep that do not belong to this fold. I will bring them also, and they will listen to my voice. So there will be one flock, one shepherd. The most likely interpretation of this passage is that the other sheep Jesus is talking about are the Gentiles, to whom he will send the apostles with his message. However, I will confess as a nerd that whenever I hear this, I kind of hope that it refers to people on other planets. But whether that's the case or not, the Good Shepherd forms all his widely differing individual sheep, even green ones with little antennas on top, into one community. And finally, the thing that separates the Good Shepherd from the bad shepherd is that the Good Shepherd will give up his life for the sheep if he has to. The sheep belong to him. His livelihood depends on them. And he takes complete responsibility for them. In much the same way that as parents, we take complete responsibility for the acts of our children, even though our children are capable of doing things that we have told them not to do. The Good Shepherd will track down and bring back that one stubborn sheep that has wandered into the valley of the shadow of death, where a bad or a mediocre shepherd would look at the situation and think, well, that one's a loss, but I don't want to risk the other ones by going after it. It's better just to lose that one. And from an economic point of view, the bad shepherd's argument makes perfect sense. But the Good Shepherd is no more willing to abandon one sheep than you or I would be to abandon just one of our children, even if the situation to outsiders looked completely hopeless. The shepherd does not just care for and protect the sheep, he loves the sheep. So now let's go back to the big, scary valley of the shadow of death. The 23rd Psalm is part of the Episcopal funeral service and of most other denominations as well. So it's easy to associate it with, literally with death, the death of a loved one, with going through a life-threatening illness yourself. And those are certainly times when you desperately need a shepherd's guidance. But there are many other kinds of valleys. There is the valley of divorce, the valley of job loss, mental illness, the valley of addiction, valley of family strife, fill in the blank. All of us, I'm sure, can think of more than one time in our lives when we have been in the valley for one reason or another. And I know that for me personally, and I'm guessing for most of you as well, that we were dependent on the love of our shepherd and of the people who love us on his behalf to get us safely through it. And we don't just pass through that valley as individuals. We can also pass through it as part of a community. A war, a natural disaster, an epidemic, financial meltdown, political instability. Those are just a few things that can send a national, a local, an ethnic, or a religious community on a trip through the valley. There are plentiful examples in the news every day of various kinds of communities that are struggling to survive in the valley of the shadow of death for a variety of reasons. And then there's this community right here in this room. When I look back on the last 3 to 4 years at St. Francis, I see a community that has walked through the valley of the shadow of death and is coming out the other side. I'm very grateful for the good shepherding that we've received from Father Joe, like we all are, and also for the shepherding that we have learned to provide for each other. I see in St. Francis a congregation that is truly living the concept of the ministry of all the baptized. And I am grateful to our Good Shepherd for using us to minister to each other on his behalf. So if Beth is preaching, there must be homework, right? Yes. And my request for you this week is to pray for the communities in our world that are in crisis right now, especially the people of Nepal, and for the continued good progress of the ministries of our community here at St. Francis, and to think about how the latter might provide some help for the former. Amen.